It is the summer of 1916. The mud of the Somme is still wet with rain when a young German machine gunner swings his weapon across the parapet and takes aim at the British trench line some 200 meters distant. Through the slit of his position, he can see movement, helmeted heads bobbing above the sandbags. He fires, the rounds crack through the air. And then something strange happens. The men do not fall. They duck, certainly. They flinch, but they do not crumple to the ground the way they had before. The German gunner adjusts, fires again, and watches in quiet bewilderment as one of the Tommies reaches up and touches the rim of whatever strange, shallow dish is sitting atop his head, and simply carries on. That dish was the Brodie helmet, and in the strange calculus of the First World War, it may well be one of the most consequential pieces of steel ever stamped out in a British factory. But here is what makes this story remarkable. The helmet was, by any conventional measure, absurd. It was wide, flat, shallow, more resembling a mushroom than any serious piece of military headgear. German soldiers mocked it. Some British soldiers were quietly embarrassed by it. And yet this peculiar object, this metal pudding basin, saved thousands of lives and fundamentally changed the way the war was fought. Why did the Germans stop shooting? Because sometimes it simply did not work. And that baffling, maddening resilience of a simple steel bowl is what we're here to understand today. To understand why the Brodie helmet mattered, you must first understand what was killing men in the trenches of the Western Front. And the answer is not what most people expect. When we imagine the First World War, we picture machine guns and rifles. We think of men advancing across no man's land into withering small arms fire. And that vision is not wrong exactly. But by the middle of the war, the statistics told a different and in many ways more horrifying story. Somewhere between 60 and 80% of all wounds sustained in the trenches were caused not by bullets, but by shell fragments. The artillery barrages that both sides unleashed on each other with industrial ferocity sent thousands of jagged metal shards in every direction, high, low, sideways, and downward. The downward angle was the crucial problem. When a shell burst in the air above a trench, which artillery officers very deliberately arranged, its fragments rained down at steep angles. A man crouching in a trench was protected from rifle fire by the trench walls themselves, but his head was exposed to the sky, and into that exposed sky rained steel. In the early years of the war, British soldiers wore soft fabric caps. The French wore kepis. Neither offered the slightest protection against metal traveling at lethal velocity. The Germans had adopted the Stahlhelm by early 1916, but their helmet was designed with a different tactical philosophy in mind, and its deep sides and pronounced rim served different purposes. The British Army, flooded with casualties from head wounds that military surgeons increasingly identified as survivable if the initial impact could be reduced, needed something fast, and they needed it to be manufacturable in the millions. The figures from field hospitals were stark. Head wounds accounted for a disproportionate number of deaths, not because the head was the most commonly struck part of the body, but because a wound to the skull was so frequently fatal even when relatively minor. A fragment that might pass through a man's arm and leave him wounded but alive would kill him outright if it struck his unprotected temple. The surgeons pressed their case to the War Office with numbers that were difficult to ignore. Something had to be done. And in the chaos of a war that was consuming men faster than anyone had imagined possible, the search for a solution landed on the desk of one John Leopold Brodie. Brodie was not a military man. He was an inventor, a practical, commercially minded Englishman who had been watching the casualty reports with the same growing alarm as everyone else, and who had, critically, been thinking about the geometry of the problem. Working in London in 1915, Brodie identified something that seems almost painfully obvious in retrospect. The vast majority of lethal shell fragments were arriving from above, not from the side, not from the front, from above. A helmet that offered maximum coverage of the top of the skull, and which extended outward to protect the sides of the head from fragments arriving at a downward angle, would address the specific threat that was actually killing men. It did not need to be a fortress. It needed to be an umbrella. His design was registered in August 1915 and was startlingly simple. A single piece of steel, eventually settled on as silicon manganese steel, roughly 1.1 millimeters thick, was pressed in a single stamp into a shallow bowl shape with a broad, flat brim. The manufacturing process was elegant in its economy. Unlike the German Stahlhelm, which required multiple pieces and a more complex forming process, the Brodie could be produced in a single pressing operation. One stamp, one piece of steel, one helmet. The steel itself was critical. It had to be hard enough to resist penetration from shell fragments, but not so brittle that it would shatter on impact. A distinction that sounds simple, but in practice required considerable metallurgical refinement. Early production models used mild steel that proved inadequate in field conditions. The switch to the harder manganese silicon alloy in later production runs significantly improved performance. At roughly 0.9 kilograms, it was heavy enough to matter and light enough to wear. The brim, that wide, almost comic brim, was the engineering heart of the design. Extending roughly 7 centimeters beyond the crown at its widest points, it deflected fragments arriving at angles of up to roughly 60 degrees from vertical. This was not the angle that rifles fired at. This was precisely the angle at which artillery fragments rained down from airburst shells. Brodie had not designed a helmet for the battlefield as it was imagined. He had designed one for the battlefield as it actually was. Production was contracted to a network of British manufacturers, with facilities in Birmingham and across the Midlands, taking on the bulk of stamping operations. By 1916, estimates suggest production had reached hundreds of thousands of units per month, though precise figures from this period remain difficult to verify. The helmet entered widespread service as the Mark I in early 1916, and the improved Mark I asterisk followed later that year. By the end of the war, the British Empire had produced somewhere in the region of 7.5 million Brodie helmets, a figure that speaks less to its design and more to the sheer, appalling scale of what the Western Front demanded. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The introduction of the Brodie helmet into active service produced results that were simultaneously gratifying and, to some observers, faintly alarming. The alarming part came first. In the months immediately following the helmet's introduction, the number of soldiers admitted to field hospitals with head wounds actually rose. This caused some consternation in military medical circles until the explanation became clear. Men were surviving head strikes that would previously have killed them outright in the trench. They were reaching the hospital rather than the mortuary. The helmet was working. The statistics, once properly interrogated, confirmed it. Head wound fatalities as a proportion of head wound casualties fell measurably once the Brodie was in widespread use. On the Somme, in the latter half of 1916, medical officers noted with satisfaction that soldiers were presenting with wounds that bore the characteristic marks of deflected fragments, grazes, partial impacts, injuries to the brim of the helmet rather than the skull beneath it. At Passchendaele the following year, soldiers in the flooded shell craters and collapsing trenches of the Ypres salient reported instances where the helmet had taken direct fragment strikes that left men dazed but alive. Exact numbers for individual incidents are, as so often in the historical record of this conflict, difficult to verify with precision. But the aggregate picture was not in doubt. German observers on the other side of the wire noted the change. Intelligence reports from the period mention British steel helmets specifically. Whether any German commander genuinely altered his fire tactics in direct response to the Brodie's introduction is a matter of historical debate. But the psychological impact on the men wearing it was real and documented. Soldiers who had felt naked beneath nothing but a fabric cap reported a measurable increase in their willingness to expose themselves briefly above the parapet, which, in the attrition logic of trench warfare, had genuine tactical value. A comparison with the German Stahlhelm reveals just how different the two nations' approaches to the same problem actually were. The Stahlhelm, designed by Dr. Friedrich Schwerd and introduced in 1916, roughly contemporaneous with the Brodie, was a radically different piece of engineering. Where Brodie had designed outward and flat, Schwerd had designed downward and deep. The Stahlhelm featured pronounced side flanges that extended down over the ears and the sides of the head, offering excellent protection from lateral threats and good coverage of the temples. It also featured a distinctive steel lug on the front that could accept an additional armored faceplate, the Sternpanzer, for use by sentries and observers in fixed positions. At roughly 1.4 kilograms, it was noticeably heavier than the Brodie. The Stahlhelm's deeper coverage made it arguably superior for protection against rifle fire and fragments arriving at flatter trajectories. But its manufacturing process was significantly more complex, requiring multiple forming operations and more raw material. This complexity meant that German production, while substantial, was never quite as rapid as British output. The American forces who entered the war in 1917 made a revealing choice. Faced with the need to equip millions of soldiers quickly, the Americans adopted a helmet that was essentially a copy of the Brodie, the M 1917. They chose it not because they thought it superior in every respect to the Stahlhelm, but because it could be manufactured at industrial speed using existing American metal pressing infrastructure. The logic of mass production drove the decision as much as the logic of ballistics. Post-war analysis, conducted with the grim efficiency that military medicine applied to these questions, suggested that the Brodie offered somewhat less lateral protection than the Stahlhelm, but superior overhead coverage. Since overhead fragments remained the dominant cause of helmet-preventable head wounds throughout the war, the Brodie's design logic was vindicated by the data. It had solved the right problem, even if it had not solved every problem. The legacy of the Brodie helmet is, like so much of the First World War, both remarkable and quietly sobering. In purely material terms, the helmet demonstrably saved thousands of lives. Military medical statistics from the latter half of the war, compared against the catastrophic head wound fatalities of 1914 and 1915, tell a story that the numbers bear out even accounting for all the methodological complications of wartime record-keeping. Men who would have died reached hospitals instead. Men who would have been hospitalized returned to duty sooner. The helmet's introduction was not a dramatic turning point in the military sense. It did not win battles or end offensives. But in the quiet arithmetic of survival, it mattered enormously. Its influence extended well beyond 1918. The basic design philosophy, wide brim, overhead coverage, single-piece construction, informed helmet development across the following decades. The British Mark II of the 1930s was a direct descendant, and the Mark III of the Second World War refined the formula further. The American M1 helmet of the Second World War, though a more sophisticated design, owed conceptual debts to the tradition the Brodie had established. The principle of designing a helmet for the actual statistical distribution of threats, rather than for the threats that looked most dramatic or felt most frightening, was an insight that Brodie had arrived at through simple geometric reasoning, and it proved durable. Original Brodie helmets survive in considerable numbers. The Imperial War Museum in London holds multiple examples, including variants from different production periods that allow the manufacturing refinements to be traced clearly. Collections across Commonwealth nations hold further specimens, and the helmet's distinctive silhouette has made it one of the most immediately recognizable artifacts of the conflict. Return for a moment to that German machine gunner on the Somme in the summer of 1916. He fires. The rounds crack through the air. The men do not fall. And in his bewilderment, in that small moment of tactical confusion produced by a shallow steel dish that looked almost comically inadequate, lies the entire story of the Brodie helmet. It did not make men invincible. It made them marginally, measurably, statistically more likely to survive. And in the mathematics of a war that was consuming human lives at a rate that still defies easy comprehension, that margin was everything. The men who wore it often joked about it. The Tommy humor of the Western Front was dark and inventive, and the pudding basin helmet attracted its share of mockery. It was ungainly. It blew off in the wind. It collected rainwater with a depressing efficiency. It looked, as one soldier's letter home reportedly put it, like something his mother might keep mushrooms in. But under artillery fire, in the mud and chaos of a contested trench line, with fragments of steel arriving from above at velocities that the human body had no evolutionary preparation to survive, that ridiculous mushroom did something that nothing else available could do. It stood between a man's skull and the sky. 7.5 million times, give or take, across the years of that war, some version of that transaction took place. A fragment struck steel. Steel deflected it. A man lived who might otherwise have died. The German machine gunner adjusted his aim, fired again, and the Tommy with the pudding basin on his head ducked, waited and carried on. That is what the ridiculous British helmet did. It kept men in the fight, and sometimes that was enough.